So CAS handles the authentication of clients and stateless service. So you can have multiple backend mailbox servers handling connections, and it doesn't really matter uh, which like you have multiple mailbox servers which are hosting different mailboxes and different mailbox databases, and you can have a single CAS server or you could have multiple, and they'll mix and match. They'll be able to talk to all of them. Okay. So you can have different entry points into your organization through CAS, but they can still all talk to the various different mailbox servers that you have in your environment. Just something to be aware of. Okay, the edge role. This is something that's coming up very soon. In about a couple of weeks, you're going to create an edge role within your environment. You're going to set up your own firewall with the DMZ, all that kind of fun networking stuff. There's a lot of DNS involved. Okay. This is not a trusted role. Basically, you put this somewhere where there's a greater chance it's going to get hacked because it's going to be exposed to the outside world, right? So you never join it to the domain. It sits in the DMZ, and it does have a little bit of access to your Active Directory, but not. It doesn't have like write access to it. It can just query. Okay. So its job is just basically to talk to all the, you know, all the deplorable web mail servers that are out there trying to send you spam and any other mail from the outside world. Okay. So if the edge role is installed, it's not going to act as a mailbox server. Those are distinct roles. You got to choose one. So if you're running an edge role, it doesn't do anything by itself. You got to have a mailbox server somewhere. Okay. Now, if you are running that edge role, that's the one that the external world is going to see. The rest of the Exchange setup is all going to be hidden inside your LAN. Okay. If you don't have an edge role server, you have to open up some access to your mail server to get any mail from the outside world. Okay, EWS we haven't talked about very much. That's Exchange Web Services. There's kind of a good reason we don't talk about it much. It's really a programmer thing. Okay. So unless your organization has developers who are actively creating apps that interact with Exchange, you're not really likely to need to configure this too much. Okay. This is an application programming interface that Microsoft came up with. That's what an API stands for. It's just a defined set of ways of communicating with Exchange. Okay, so a developer can use that API to talk to Exchange without understanding the underlying protocols too well. And then they can develop their app off of that. So they can go and make queries about calendars and things like that, right? Get and receive mail without having to understand how everything works. So unless you've got programmers who are asking for access to this, if you just get some random Joe in your organization who's really just an email user and they're asking for you to make changes to EWS, that's weird. They either don't know what they're doing or they're doing something they probably shouldn't be doing. So in that kind of case, your little rabbit ears should go up, and you should be like, "What's going on here?" But if it is a developer and they have a particular project which relates to Exchange, that can make sense. Okay, so really, it does depend, but you're not going to bump into this too often unless you're working with programmers. Okay, so this allows for integration with third-party tools for things like help desk. You're not going to see the typical end user asking about this. Okay. Auto Discover, I covered this before. This is the thing that actually sets up your Windows, your Outlook clients, right? So that it's not asking users a bunch of questions about like, what's the server you're trying to connect to? What's your username and password? It uses single sign-on from Windows, and it explores Active Directory to figure out the answers that it needs so that it doesn't have to ask us anything. Okay, so that's a nice service. I like it. It usually just works out of the box unless you're going outside. So if you're coming in from the outside world, you're not able to query Active Directory. That's not going to be something that they typically allow for security reasons. In that case, you have to set up a virtual directory as an administrator. and call it Auto Discover, and you've got to have an XML file in there that answers all the questions that Active Directory would normally answer. Okay, so domain joined internal clients and non-domain joined external clients can use Auto Discover. It's just the non-domain joined need that XML file in that virtual directory, and domain joined can just browse over the local area network. Okay, if you're doing online exchange, it flips. And so in your organization, there's nothing in AD that you'll be able to use to actually query. You're going to have to go out to Microsoft's cloud, and you're going to have to talk to that virtual directory associated with your domain, and you're going to have to get the configuration as if you were an outsider. Except the reason is it's because the server is outside. It's not part of your Active Directory. Okay. So you need an external DNS entry for external clients to use it, essentially, and that includes online exchange. Okay, SCP. I'm mentioning this specifically because it gets confused with OCSP. Okay, so because they're a little similar, this is a service connection point. This is part of Auto Discover. Okay, it's the Active Directory object that contains the XML information that Auto Discover needs. So typically URLs that allow you to kind of configure everything. It's all XML formatted. If there's any kind of problem with this formatting, XML is very, very picky. Okay. So I had a case where one student, I think they had a space at the end of their XML string, and that messed up their Auto Discover altogether. Okay. And it's not like they actually put the space there. There was some other mess up on the part of Exchange itself. Usually we don't even interact with that. But as we dug deeper into the problem, it turned out that's what the cause was. Okay. Why it happened to them, I'm not sure. That was back in Exchange 2013. I haven't seen it since, but it was a weird one. But just to say, you can get some weird problems if the SCP object's not working. So the AD object can be found in Active Directory sites and services. You can actually drill down and locate it. You can go and edit the content in it, but that's kind of advanced stuff you don't want to do unless you have to. It's a bit like going into the registry, right? If you know what you're doing, that's fine. If you don't know what you're doing, you can mess things up pretty bad. So the main reason I'm mentioning this, because that's a bit niche, is just not to confuse SCP objects with OCSP, the OCSP protocol, which is something that we'll talk about in a second. Okay, and that's related to PKI. So we're using certificates. You've probably already configured your certificate, or you're pretty close to it. We use this to authenticate the server. Okay, sometimes clients, when we're setting up security, we will be using certificates then, but we always want SSL in place, right? So this makes use of public key cryptography. You've explored that a little bit in the other course, but we digitally sign the certificates in order to make this function so that everybody can recognize that whether someone is legit or not. Okay, so you can encrypt your emails. You can verify that an email actually came from a particular person, and you can verify that the server is not some kind of impersonator, right? So you're either using an enterprise CA or a third-party CA. If you're getting Exchange to work on premises, you're dealing with an enterprise CA. If you're going out onto online Exchange, you're doing third-party CA. Okay. So enterprise CAs are typically used for internal AD domain join clients, and then the other one is for the outside world. Exchange, we got to install that certificate on the server. But within an Active Directory domain, you can also set it up for the clients. Okay. I'm not too sure how Online Exchange sets it up for the clients. That's something I haven't really looked at too much. I imagine you'd have to go into the administrative interface and assign them one, which, doesn't sound like much fun. But not everybody uses client authentication. A lot of the time, they just rely on username and password and multi-factor authentication. So it's not always needed. Okay. Now, OCSP, this was the thing, if you remember me talking about Apple a while ago and how Apple had a case where none of their client software would function because their network was overwhelmed. And it was because they were upgrading, they were offering upgrades to their OS, and everybody was hitting that server, but that server was on the same pipe as their OCSP responder. Okay. And so because the OCSP responder wasn't able to respond, a lot of apps just hung and wouldn't function. Okay. So kind of like they denial of service themselves, essentially. Uh, it stands for Online Certificate Status Protocol. And really what it's about is CRLs. Okay. So if we go to certificate services, um, and we've worked with CRLs before. Those are certificate revocation lists, right? What you're really doing is you're checking to say, okay, this cert looks good, um, but how do I know if it's not been stolen or cracked or something like that? So we always go back and we check with the CRL to see whether that particular cert has been revoked. Okay, and if it's been revoked, then we don't use it, right? So the original implementation of that was not very efficient. And basically, what it meant is that your servers could be overwhelmed a little bit if you had too many requests. So somebody implemented Online Certificate Status Protocol as an alternative to the original implementation of CRLs. Okay, it's still the same idea. It's just done it's done much more briefly, essentially. Okay, so Microsoft supports OCSP, and we actually use it in Exchange, but you don't have to use it. It's just an alternative to the old school one. Okay. So this is more efficient than CRLs. So Apple was actually using that. That wasn't what caused their denial of service. What caused it was the choking of their internet connection, right? But the way that OCSP works is a certificate is checked against an online responder, which is just a web service sitting there, right, on the net or in your environment. And then it confirms. It just basically it does the emperor's like thumbs up, thumbs down, or I'm not really sure. Okay. So you have those three statuses. Good, revoked is thumbs down, and unknown means I can't really answer your question. So be careful, right? When it does that, I'm not too clear. So under what circumstances it's going to say unknown? It basically means it doesn't have the information, but it's up to the client, I think, at that point to decide what to do. Okay. So the Windows implementation of this protocol, we use that in Exchange in Exercise 2, right? But in our other certificate course, like in the Securing AD, we don't really focus on it too much because it's just an alternative, really. SSL, Secure Sockets Layer. This is also known as TLS. Okay. They're the same. Well, they're not quite the same thing. It depends whether you're a purist, but people use the terms interchangeably. Okay. Secure Sockets Layer actually came out of Netscape Navigator back in the day. And it was hacked essentially. Not basically the keys that they generated were predictable. Okay, which is not a good thing. So it was compromised, and as a response, they took that same protocol and re-released it with a more robust method of generating keys, which is called TLS. Other than that, it's not that different. Okay, so the whole purpose here is to encrypt communications between parties that don't know each other. Okay. If you already know each other, you can set up other types of encryption. But if you don't know each other, that's where SSL is really handy. Okay. And, we've seen in the last 5 years a real take, like everybody's adopting SSL now, maybe 10 years, right? Where the default behavior of a website is to immediately put you into SSL. Okay. Now, PKI is the infrastructure, the public key infrastructure that allows for key exchange or verification of keys between parties, even if they don't know each other. And the way that that works is you have a third party that vouches for each of you, right? So SSL requires PKI in order to be legit. Uh, if you're using something like a self-signed cert, yeah, you are following the protocol, but you're not actually securing your infrastructure. Okay, so people can't look through your traffic that easily unless someone's acting as a man in the middle. So it is a bit of a barrier, but it's not a very robust one. So the TLS handshake negotiates what the server can do and the client can do. It finds a common set of capabilities and then settles down on that to encrypt the traffic. Okay, so what could that mean? That could mean, what kind of symmetric encryption do you support? You know, what kind of protocol are we going to use to negotiate that? Right. So when there's the initial setup, they kind of state, this is what I can do. What can you do? This is what I can do. Okay, let's do these things. Now we're gonna get down and actually set up an encrypted tunnel. Okay. Uh, so Exchange 2019 uses SSL by default, but it does start with self-signed certificates, which are not something you should use in production, just to be clear. Okay. Sometimes that is the way you'll find environments where, the odd thing is a self-signed cert. That's I would consider that to be a bit of a whoopsie. Okay, especially in an important server. So the secure practice is to set up a third-party signed certificate in production environments. If you're just working internally, enterprise is good enough. Okay, now we're getting to some protocols which are the underlying uh, the underlying protocols of Exchange Outlook Anywhere. Okay, so MAPI over HTTP and RPC over HTTP. These are the two core protocols, proprietary ones that Microsoft has come up with for clients talking to the server. And the idea is the original one was RPC over HTTP. Okay. So they were using RPC, just stands for remote procedure call. Um, and RPC is something that is built into the Windows operating system. So they've been using it before the internet. Like RPC goes back to Windows workgroups. Okay. But the idea with RPC is that you can issue commands over the network to be executed on a remote server. So Windows sharing involves RPC. Okay. Um, what other ones involve RPC? I believe work groups involve RPC. Okay. And there's even some NetBIOS naming, which involves RPC. So they used it for some old stuff. And then in Exchange, they used it as well. Okay. But what they did was they wrapped it in HTTP. So they would send RPC requests over HTTP. Sorry, I got a little bit of a cat allergy going on here. So this was what was originally used. It's not being used anymore. And they didn't always encrypt the channel. So it used to be you could have just plain HTTP. Okay. There were problems with this. So RPC over HTTP, what it essentially does is it takes messaging API payloads. So that's what Exchange actually uses. Sends it over, wraps it up over RPC, and then wraps that over HTTP. So I'm just gonna give you a little bit of a graphic of that. It's a terrible graphic, but I made it myself, so I'm gonna keep it. Let's just see how it displays. Yeah, there we go. Look at that off center. I know it bugs some people, but this is basically how this works. Okay. You have your Exchange payload. So that's all the data that Exchange actually wants. You wrap that in a messaging API wrapper. So you've got a specific API that programmers can use to send these payloads. Okay. And all of that gets sent over an RPC wrapper, which then gets sent over an HTTP SSL wrapper. Okay. So we're tunneling payload. Right. Now, as you can see, that's a whole lot of layers. Right. And so, um, eventually Microsoft realized, wow, this is a lot of overhead. And that's actually like reducing our ability to handle load on the server. Okay. So let me just go back to the slides here. So, they eventually decided, I think we can do things more. We think we can do things more efficiently. How do we do that? We're going to take out the RPC middleman. Okay. So they still needed MAPI, but now they're sending that directly through HTTP. Problem is, if you have older clients, and that's becoming less of an issue, but Office 2007 and earlier, they only speak RPC over HTTP. They don't support MAPI over HTTP. Okay. And so in your organization, currently with Server 2019, the default is using this newer implementation. But if you have old clients or even a few old clients, you want to be able to turn on both of these features so that either or can be used. Okay, just something you'll bump into potentially with some client who's really stuck on an old piece of software and says, "I don't want to move over to online. I don't want to pay for it." You know. So MAPI over HTTP is just a simplification of the previous one. We have um, fewer tunnels to deal with. Okay, so if we go back and we just check out this one, it's the same idea, but we've gotten rid of that RPC wrapper. Okay, and what they realized was that MAPI can do everything that RPC did, so why don't we just take out that middleman? Okay. And what they found was that they got much better performance on the server side. It could handle load a lot more effectively. Okay. Which meant it could take more clients. A single server could handle more clients when you implemented this protocol. Okay. So this is the current default. Just be aware of that older one. Dim memory, so if you ever have to do some troubleshooting and you encounter that, you'll be like, oh, yeah, okay. Now, Outlook Anywhere is just both of these technologies. It's an umbrella term for both of these technologies. Okay. Really, it's just a marketing term, which is saying, we can go over the internet through HTTP and SSL, and you don't have to worry about setting up VPN connections, right? And so all of your data, all your client data, can channel through these tunnels without any kind of complicated setup other than SSL. Okay. But really, under the hood, it's just one of these two protocols. So this is just a nice name that they can use to sell it a little bit better. Okay. So the nice thing with these is because you're using SSL, you're getting through corporate firewalls without any complicated setup. If you tried to do this with pure RPC, you'd have a whole bunch of ports you have to open up. But because we're tunneling it all through SSL, there's a single port that we have to worry about, right? And then you just punch a hole, that one port hole, and everything works okay. So cloud-based Exchange setups use Outlook Anywhere by default, since even internal clients are considered outside, right? And then collectively add these up, RPC plus MAPI equals Outlook Anywhere. Okay, just keep that in mind. So if somebody's talking about this, they're really talking about these, and they're most likely talking about MAPI over HTTP. Okay, now HTTPS, that's just a protocol it's just the term we use for SSL and HTTP put together, right? The unholy union. So Exchange uses MAPI over HTTP for internal client connections, but SSL is what provides us with the security that we need. Okay. So you join those two together. HTTP is a very well implemented protocol. It's supported everywhere, but it lacks security. SSL brings us the security, and then we tunnel Exchange through that. So HTTPS refers to the carrier security part of that communication, the two outer layers, right? Exchange Active Sync This is again, it's a mobile device thing essentially, right? Tablets, mobile devices, um, things like um, what's it called? Android. You know, if you're not able, not quite. Um, Mac doesn't typically use this. Mac actually has an implementation of Exchange, but you're going to get the odd client that isn't able to use Exchange, and they'll be using ActiveSync instead. So it's an alternative. It's a bit of a weaker alternative. For mobile devices, it does have some nice features because you can implement security. So you can like wipe a device if it's lost or stolen. Um, you can kind of determine who's allowed to connect into your network based on what type of device they have. So you can register them and all that kind of thing. This is all implemented in online Exchange as well. Okay. And you can enable this or disable this on a per user basis. So you may be getting like, upper management who have fancier devices that don't actually support Exchange, ironically, and then you can make exceptions for them. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Next class, we're going to be switching over to the mailbox role. That's going to be the emphasis for the next little while. That's going to be assignment 2, which is coming out on Monday. Okay. This one's a bit of a bigger one than the last one, so I don't know how big you thought that was. But it's going to get, it's going to take, there's going to be more PowerShell. There's going to be slightly longer, uh, more time that you're going to have to devote to the next one coming up. Okay. It's also more important in a way. Once you finish with this one, coming up, not this assignment 1, but once assignment 2 is done, that's when you really want to make like I would say, a duplicate backup somewhere, because there's a fair amount of work involved in setting everything up. You don't want to redo it at that point. What we've done so far, it's a lesser version of that in the sense of having to rebuild. Okay, it's not as big a deal. But coming up, you're definitely going to want to take some kind of backup. Okay. Any questiones? Okay. So let me just do the one last check here before I let you go. Oh yeah, I did want to say some things. This is just nuts and bolts. Um, this is the first time we're doing evaluations and marks on Brightspace. So if there's something that's going wrong, like I don't know, let's say, I said I'm flexible with due dates. It might be that Brightspace cuts you off at the knees the end of the day today, Um, if you can't submit, just contact me. Don't freak out. We're just, trying out our new car here. So we're going to learn about the quirks of this learning management system over time here. I'm freaking out. I'm just saying, don't freak out. Why are you freaking out? So don't sweat it too much, okay? It's especially in this course. I'm very chill in this course. Um, so if you can't actually submit something, just send me a message, and I'd like to tweak the LMS to see if I can fix it. And if I can't, I'll just accept your submission through Teams or email. Okay. But I'd like to fix it first if we can. So give me a heads up if there's something that's acting weird. Okay. Other than a Mingus, because that's normal. But don't freak out. Okay. So yeah, A2 coming out next class, and I'll do a fairly big talk on some things associated with it. Okay. All right, I'll let you guys go. I'll lurk in the background if you need any assistance with anything. Just kind of let me know. I'll tell you if I'm walking away for a coffee or something, but I'll be back quick.